My name is Guy Adams, and this is the real story of Gene Hackman's death. I've worked on Fleet Street for 25 years, as everything from a gossip columnist to a foreign correspondent covering Los Angeles and the western half of America. And today I'm going to take you to Santa Fe in New Mexico to look into the final days of the late Hollywood star Gene Hackman. We walked up into the hills to his house, we drove around speaking to his friends, we even visited the local prison to have a chat to the cops. There were all sorts of wild rumours doing the rounds in the weeks and months after Gene Hackman's death. But fundamentally, when you sift through all the noise, the truth of this story comes down to one very real and sad state of affairs. To get to the bottom of this story, I flew to Denver in Colorado and then drove through the Rocky Mountains to Santa Fe. And while the truth of the story became clear, what we also discovered in that town was a very touching story about the connection that Gene and his wife Betsy had with their little community. One of the reasons Gene Hackman lived here, apart from obviously, here's a typical house we're about to go past, and it's like perched on the hillside, amazing views. Yeah, very cool. I think one of the reasons he lived here was he had 3 dogs, and I think they kind of doted on them, and there's some really good trails around to walk your dogs on. And we're going to go and walk on one in a minute. We're just finding the entrance to it, and hopefully we can walk sort of up this canyon and maybe even get a view of his actual house. We'll see. Here's the start of the trail. We're going to have a walk and see what we can find in my hilariously inappropriate clothing. But I'm a journalist, not a rambler, so off we go. We can't get anywhere near Gene Hackman's house if we go up a road, but around his house, and probably one of the reasons he used to live here, is there's a lot of these trails where you can walk your dog. And I'm pretty sure from looking at the map that if we follow this trail into the hills, we might be able to actually find Gene's house. All we can see up there at the moment is trees, but I have hopes that we're going to be able to see more, although it's quite a steep hill and we're at the bottom of it. Anyway, let's have a look. It's quite tiring. Santa Fe is at quite a high altitude, so the air's pretty thin. I'm feeling very middle-aged and unfit and out of breath. It's terrific. I'm going to get my compass out. That's the level we've sunk to. Due east is that direction, and the house of Gene Hackman is due east. And it is 200 yards away, and that is it. So behind me you can see a white van, and just behind it the top of a house, and that's the edge of the Hackman residence where Gene and Betsy lived, and all around me they're the views they had. It's kind of the opposite of Hollywood or New York or any of the places that movie stars are often drawn to. It's really quite quiet, and it's a very beautiful town, certainly by American standards. There are no skyscrapers. The town centre is made up of these kind of pretty single-storey adobe buildings. And it's a kind of calm, laid-back place where you can almost get lost. Before we get into the meat of this story, I think it's important to understand who Gene Hackman was. And by that I mean he was a genuine Hollywood legend. He appeared in 80 movies, maybe even a few more. He was nominated for 5 Oscars, and he won twice. Gene Hackman came from very humble roots. He was born in the Great Depression in Illinois and raised in a sort of broken home. His father had left when he was very young. And in 1946, when he turned 16, he actually joined the United States Marines. Spent 10 years serving his country overseas. It wasn't until the 60s, after he'd come back from service and he'd married for the first time, that he actually decided to try his hand at acting. He was in his sort of mid to late 20s, and it took him about a decade to really hit the big time. His first sort of major breakthrough, and the film that turned him into a household name, is also my favourite Gene Hackman story. It's called The French Connection. And it's a proper old-school 1970s cop film set in New York. And what's brilliant about the movie is that Gene Hackman's performance, he plays a sort of brooding cop in a dirty anorak who spends inordinate amounts of time trying to crack a drug smuggling case and never quite manages to do it. That film won Gene the Best Actor Oscar, and from then on he was a Hollywood legend with sort of all the benefits that entails: houses, money, a glamorous life, celebrity friends. Gene Hackman had married in the mid-60s and had 3 children with his first wife. But as he became a sort of genuine star in the 1970s and early 80s, like many couples, they started to grow apart. And in the mid-1980s, he met the woman who was to be his second wife, who was at his side throughout his life and also, as we're going to discover, at his death. Betsy Arakawa was a professional concert pianist, and she'd been raised in Hawaii and had come to Los Angeles in the 1980s to study at the University of Southern California. When Gene Hackman met her, she was actually working part-time in a gym that he was a member at, and I think the story is that Gene had forgotten his entrance card and she stopped him going in, didn't realise he was a Hollywood star, and they had a bit of an argument. Although things may not have got off on quite the right foot, they soon became an item and they married in the early 1990s. Gene was really quite proud of Betsy and would often recall how she liked to play one of the 2 grand pianos they kept in their house. And he, in an interview, once described her saying, "She's excellent, as good as they get." In the 1990s, Gene and Betsy had begun spending quite a lot of time in a town called Santa Fe in New Mexico, which is a little bit removed from the bright lights of Hollywood and quite a nice place to have a quiet existence if you're a Hollywood star. In 2004, Gene retired from acting, or at least from making movies, and he and Betsy began to live in Santa Fe almost full-time. And they devoted what became a 20-year retirement to wholesome and quite laid-back pursuits. Gene would play golf. He spent a lot of time painting. He was a very keen amateur artist. Gene was also a keen fly fisherman. There's some excellent rivers full of trout around Santa Fe. And I spoke a little bit about the time he spent on them with Ivan Valdez, who runs the town's biggest fishing shop.
And as you can see from this photograph, which has pride of place on the, I guess you call this your trophy wall, Ivan is a fishing guide and has taken one Gene Hackman out several years ago. Tell me about this day.
This day particular was about, I'd say, 9 years ago.
Okay.
And Gene's wife, Betsy, had given me a call, and she was like, "Would you like to take him and Jack Del Rio out?" He's a former NFL coach.
Okay.
Or actually, I still think he's in the NFL. And I was like, sure.
Okay.
And you know, so I booked the trip and then hung the phone up, and then I'm like, what did I just get into? So I was super nervous, you know, a lot of anxiety. And when Gene introduced himself, you know, I mean, a lot of that went away. He was just such a kind soul and just made the day super smooth. And I mean, you know, all that anxiety went out the door.
And tell us about this particular triumph.
So the water was pretty dirty, and I was like, but I was, Gene, there's some big fish that live in this little hole here, and let's go see if we can catch one. And sure enough, he hooked into one, and the rodeo was on, that was for sure, and managed to land it. And as you can see, we were all smiles.
And tell me, what sort of a guy is Gene Hackman? I mean, and obviously most people know him as a film star who was famous for playing kind of baddies or like slightly troubled cops, or
sure,
you know, Lex Luthor in Superman.
Jack of all trades, right?
Right.
I mean, I couldn't say enough of good things about him. You know, when we started the day, I'm like, what the heck am I going to talk to him about, right?
Yeah,
I'm
right.
like, I don't want to start talking about movies and like, you know, just starstruck, all that stuff. So we struck up a few conversations, and we had a mutual sport that we really enjoyed, which was boxing. And, that, and spoke a lot about family. And then, you know, second half of the day, I asked him about some of his movies, and like a couple of them that I really enjoyed. One was Uncommon Valor, which was maybe not one of his more popular movies, but my brother and I really enjoyed watching it when we were kids. And of course, Hoosiers.
Yes.
You know, and he was like, he dove into it a little bit. Yeah, Uncommon Valor, well, it was made to look like we were in Thailand and stuff like that, but in reality, we were in Hawaii, and it was gorgeous there.
Yeah.
And, but he was just a great guy, man. I couldn't say enough good things about him. It was an experience of a lifetime for me.
Yeah.
I mean, Gene Hackman's a legend.
He'd spend quite a lot of time in town as well, attending art classes, often sort of incognito. People I've spoken to said they kind of knew that this guy used to be a Hollywood star, but he was very much left to his own devices and just treated like a normal member of the community. I also went to visit Doug Langham. Doug's a local businessman, and he and Gene co-owned for a time a chain of Pan-Asian restaurants called Ginger. Doug has lots of fond memories of the time he spent with Gene, and Doug got almost quite tearful talking about the years they spent together.
It would have been 2004. A mutual friend introduced us. He'd brought Gene and Betsy in for lunch.
Right.
And he said, hey, come on over. So we went over, met Gene and Betsy, and so of course Gene, hey, sit down. So he's really interested in the food. Betsy was a really, really good cook. We said, well, tomorrow at 2 o'clock, we're going to be cooking in our kitchen, some new items, and hey, if y'all want to come cook with us, come cook with us. And Betsy goes, great idea. So at 2 o'clock next day, here comes Betsy, looking, just so classy and so wonderful, like she always did. And here comes Gene behind her,
Yeah.
with his cooler. He's got a cooler. He's walking behind Betsy.
He wants to take his food home.
Well, Betsy's going to cook with us.
Right.
And so he had all of Betsy's ingredients. So you go in the kitchen. Of course, we're all kind of nervous and, how's this going to work out? We had a blast. Just had the greatest time.
So when they were involved in your business, were they hands-on or kind of?
It was incredible. When you see Gene and Betsy, kind of coming, everyone just lights up.
Yeah.
They're so happy to see him. They're so, in their environment, where they're kind of okay with it. They're so open and so gracious and, just very caring people.
Many of the paintings that Gene did in retirement ended up on the walls of Ginger, and he gifted lots of them to Doug.
So the first time Gene said, come up to the studio. So I went in to the studio and had this big wall of all these paintings. And he said, well, which one do you like the most? I said, no doubt about it, Gene. I said, I love that. And so he just kind of reached up and handed it to me.
And what did he do with all his paint? Just gave them to his mates?
His friends and, close friends. I think it was a passion that allowed him to just, mind and body and spirit, just, kind of get away from things.
Yeah.
And he's so good at it. So we've cataloged all of his artwork. That's done. This is the catalog number.
Yeah.
And that'll sync up with the catalog. And then
So people can go to your restaurant and find the one.
we'll have the catalog and they can look through it. And also what I've been working on is just a security system for the artwork. So
Because you think someone might try and steal it.
it's already happened.
Is it?
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
Doug was telling me about some of the rounds of golf he and Gene used to have, and he found something he had in his house that he was very keen to show me.
He was a golfer as well.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Any good?
Played a lot of golf.
Right.
A lot of golf. And that is a fun story.
I'm struggling to read the writing, but it seems that fair lads that ye something captain deduct his expenses
You're doing good.
at were something in the paying of the so-called wager. Here then are the aforementioned particulars. £3.20 for something.
At Whole Foods.
A plastic container. £1.20 for cutting of said vessel.
I'll tell you the story.
$5 tip to hotel handyman to cut the top of the container. £4.10 for the coin of the realm. Don't know what that is. $20 in pennies. £2 transshipping charges. Running around Whole Foods, etc. I pay this debt under protest, as I deem it to be taking advantage of older people. Signed, Captain Hollywood. So, yeah. What's all this about?
We play a lot of golf, and
Yeah.
I would play Gene and my business partner and Gene's business partner, Tom Allen.
Yeah.
And we always had a game. We always had a bet. And Gene kind of forgot about paying his debt. So one day I go, after about a year, I said, hey, Gene,
Tab's running.
That's $22. He goes, $22? What do you mean $22? For the bet. And he said, $22. I said, yes, sir. He can give you that look. And he said, $22. And he just turned around and walked off. I said, shit, that didn't go very well. So about a week later, I'm sitting in my little office there in the restaurant, and the hostess comes back and said, oh, Gene's here. I said, oh, great. What table? She said, no. He's got this big toolbox, and it's on wheels, and he's bringing it back to your office right now. I said, what? I said, he knows I don't know anything about tools, and I know he doesn't either. And so we're kind of laughing. So he shows up. I open the little door, and he looks at me and goes, $22, huh? He takes a little handle and he walks off. So I'm sitting there looking at this huge toolbox.
Right.
And so I called Tom. I said, Tom, Gene just brought this toolbox, and I have no idea. I said, why don't you come in? Let's take a look. So Tom came down. So we opened it up, and guess what's in it? $22 worth of pennies.
Oh, great. Yeah, okay.
Along with this note. And this, to me, tells you a lot about who he is.
Well, he was a pretty elaborate prank because he's stained the paper.
Took all the writing, he did the handwriting, no telling how long he took to write it all and come up with it. But we called him Captain Hollywood. He loved it. We would travel over to Scottsdale to play golf or look at real estate for more restaurant sites. And here'd be Gene in the back seat of our rental car, Tom and I up front. Here's Gene Hackman in the back seat.
Yeah.
We're going, no, I don't like that site. Okay, this site. And then, about 4 or 5 hours of this, and Gene would go, can I make an observation? Is it a true statement to say that none of these sites are any good that have a karate studio or a massage parlor? I said, that's pretty close, Gene. That's just what a sense of humor he had.
Gene was something of a holdout against mobile telephones, and even into the 2010s and even the 2020s, he refused to own a smartphone. Betsy would instead have a sort of joint one and would manage their affairs from that. And sadly, as we discovered, that was one of the things that may have contributed to the circumstances of his death. When COVID struck, Gene Hackman was about to turn 90, and he was already somewhat frail. He'd had a heart bypass operation the previous year, and the lockdown, I think, came at a time when Betsy felt that he was still quite vulnerable, and so the couple really locked themselves away and isolated. Almost all of the friends I spoke to said that although they'd been quite close to Betsy and Gene for many years and had seen them often, after the pandemic they never really regained contact. They'd send the odd text message or email. The other quite striking thing was that although their house in the hills above Santa Fe was pretty large, quite rambling, and was in about 12 acres of grounds, they didn't have any staff. They didn't have any cleaners who came in or housekeepers who came to help with cooking. And again, as we shall see, that is one of the things that contributed to the circumstances of Gene Hackman's death. I think the reason for this was probably that Betsy was quite a proud woman and didn't like the thought of having to rely on other people to look after her husband. In his final years, she really became almost a full-time carer. Gene Hackman's children regard Betsy with great affection, I discovered, and they all think she did a pretty wonderful job of looking after him in those difficult final years. Betsy had last been seen in public on February the 11th when she drove to Santa Fe, about 20 minutes from their house, to visit a pharmacy. Her last known phone and email conversations were on the 11th and 12th of February. They included a message to her masseuse saying that Jean had woken up ill, but that a test had ruled out COVID. She decided to reschedule her appointment out of what she called an abundance of caution. Also on the 11th, Betsy had gone onto Amazon and ordered something called a respirator, which is one of those masks you can hook up to an oxygen tank and it'll help you breathe. And I suppose this indicates that they were both feeling quite bad. Police reports obtained by the Daily Mail suggest that there were also open bookmarks on Betsy's computer, suggesting that she'd been researching quite severe symptoms that she thought were probably related to a cold or flu. Things like nausea, dizziness, even nosebleeds. No one heard anything from Betsy or Jean after that point, and everything sort of went quiet until February the 26th, when a handyman who had been doing work on their property thought things had been a little quiet and decided to go and see what might have happened. The handyman's name was Jesse Kessler, and he'd worked on the property for around 16 years. He also called the security guard on their property. It's part of a sort of gated community, and they both went to the house to investigate. Here's the 911 call they made.
Santa Fe 911, what is it? Emergency?
Hello, my name is the caretaker for Santa Fe Summit. We just found one deceased person inside a house.
Are you with the patient now?
Yeah, I'm over at their property. There's no address here. So I have to meet the ambulance or the police, whoever, down at the gatehouse.
Is the patient a male or a female?
A female and a male, probably. I don't know, sir. Just send somebody up here real quick.
Okay. Are they breathing?
I have no idea. I'm not inside the house. It's closed. It's locked. I can't go in. But I see them. She's laying down on a floor from the window.
Are they moving at all?
No, dude, they're not moving. Just send somebody up here really quick.
Okay, my units are underway, okay?
First responders found Betty lying on the bathroom floor. There was an open pill bottle nearby, with medicine strewn across a countertop. Jean, who was 95, was found lying on the floor of the house's boot room. Next to him were his walking stick and a pair of sunglasses. Two of the couple's 3 dogs were running around the property in a state of some distress. The third was a Kelpie named Zinner, which is short for Zinfandel, which was Jean's favourite type of red wine. Zinner had just had major surgery and was being kept in a cage by the couple while she recovered. Unfortunately, she couldn't get out, and therefore she had also died, seemingly from dehydration. The authorities described both bodies as being in a state of what they called partial mummification. That may sound a little unusual, not to mention creepy, but actually in this part of New Mexico it's a reasonably frequent occurrence, because the town of Santa Fe sits at significant altitude of over 2,000 metres, and the air is very warm and dry and dusty. We think Betsy died on the 11th or 12th of February, and we know that Gene Hackman died on the 18th, because that was the last date that his pacemaker worked. Now, in his final months, it seems that Gene Hackman had been suffering from dementia, and that this had got progressively more and more severe. And because of this, it seems that when Betsy passed away, Gene may have been unaware, and he was certainly unable to raise an alarm. And so he spent the final 6 days of his life alone and unable to get anyone to help. When the news first broke that Gene and Betsy's bodies had been discovered in such unusual circumstances, all sorts of theories began to do the rounds about how they might have died. When it emerged that an open pill bottle and lots of tablets had been found next to Betsy, some wondered whether she might have taken her own life, and perhaps even whether Gene had done the same thing in a sort of suicide pact. However, it later emerged that these tablets were standard over-the-counter medication used to treat colds and flu. Another line of inquiry that's always pursued in cases like this involves a potential gas leak, and engineers from the New Mexico Gas Company were indeed called to the property. And they did discover a small leak, but it was concluded quite quickly that the levels of carbon monoxide that had been emitted into the house were not enough to cause significant harm to either of the inhabitants. Forensic teams from the police then combed the property for signs of any sort of break-in or struggle. But although the doors and windows were open, there was no sign that they'd been forced, and there was no evidence that any of the couple's possessions were missing. One other potential line that emerged while I was actually in Santa Fe involves a potential stalker. It seems that one morning in December, about 2 months before they died, Jean and Betsy had got into their truck and driven to a town called White Rock, about 45 minutes away. There's a dog park there and they like to have picnics in it. After they left the gated community where they lived, they'd have turned left onto the main road. And it was here that Betsy later recalled a car started to follow them. The vehicle seemed to have plates from Texas, and it followed the couple through a couple of sets of traffic lights and several junctions. When Jean and Betsy got to their destination and parked their car, the driver of the other vehicle got out and came towards them, and he had in his hand a load of photographs that he wanted Jean to sign. Betsy asked him to leave. I think Jean was very frail by this stage and she didn't really want him to be bothered. The same man would appear several weeks later when the couple went out for lunch in a town called Pacos. As they were going across the car park outside a restaurant, he came up to them and this time he gave them a bottle of wine and again asked them if Jean wouldn't mind signing an autograph. Betsy seems to have been, in the words of her hairdresser Christopher, frazzled by this stalker. Now we know this because in the days after her death had emerged, Christopher had got in touch with the police, saying he wanted to share some concerns he'd had about a conversation with Betsy involving this individual. We found out about Christopher because while I was in Santa Fe, the police released body cam footage of some of the interviews they'd done in the aftermath of the incident, and I therefore thought it might be worth trying to find him. The problem was that there were 6 hairdressers in Santa Fe with the first name Christopher, and the only way we could find him was to go door to door looking for the chap. So the police have released body cam footage of some of their investigation into the death, and one of the more interesting interviews is with a hairdresser who's identified in the video as only as Christopher. And Christopher said he'd cut Betsy Hackman's hair quite recently, and she'd complained that she thought they were being sort of stalked, followed by some sort of crazed fan in the weeks and months leading up to their death. Now, this could be nothing or it could be something, and it's really hard to tell because the police body cam footage is very short and it's been kind of clipped. But I've done a bit of a search of all the hair salons in Santa Fe, and there is one just over here which does seem to be run by someone called Christopher. So I'm going to go in there and see if he is indeed the man who was on the body cam footage. Christopher told the police, and I quote, "This has not sat well with me. They don't look like celebrities. They look like everyday, normal people. And it's creepy that someone would do that somebody would follow them in a car." I tracked Christopher down and spoke to him, and I concluded that he was almost certainly a reliable source and that the events he described had almost certainly happened. But because of medical evidence, we were able to discount the theory that the stalker had any involvement at all. There were also a lot of reports suggesting Jean had become some sort of a recluse, and also that he was estranged from his family and particularly his 3 children. From what I can make out, none of those reports have much truth in them. His children were in fact in regular contact with the couple via telephone, although they did live in different states, so meeting face to face was tricky. His son Christopher also helped manage some of Jean's investments, including some commercial properties, and seems to have actually been with Betsy's mother in Hawaii when news of their death broke. In previous interviews, Jean has been asked about his family, and he has often said and accepts that he was quite distant during the children's childhood and that it was something he regrets. But I think certainly since retirement, he'd been trying to make amends for that. The children also seem to have thought quite highly of Betsy, and in particular of the way she cared for their father. On March the 7th, about 10 days after the bodies had been discovered, the police investigation was suddenly called off. It emerged that autopsy reports had proven that the couple's deaths were almost certainly due to natural causes. In a press conference, Heather Jarrell, who is the chief medical examiner for New Mexico, announced that the autopsy had shown that Betsy had died from something called hantavirus. It's a very rare but extremely serious infection caused by contact with mice or rats. Specifically, it's a type of infection you can catch in this part of the world if you breathe in a rodent's urine or droppings or saliva. It's extremely rare, but somewhere between a third and a half of all people who contract it end up dying. Now, typically, hantavirus is something that affects people who work in agriculture. If you're a farmer and you're cleaning out a barn, or you're going to feed animals and there's a lot of dust in the air, those are the circumstances in which you normally would end up catching this. And that rather begged the question of how similar conditions might have come to exist in Gene Hackman's house. Body cam footage that was later released by the police showed that although this property is sort of large and rambling and in some respects quite smart, it was also absolutely full of stuff in a condition of sort of some, I don't want to say squalor, but it was quite untidy. There were piles of clothes everywhere, boxes of things and belongings. And although, again, it was reasonably clean, it was also the sort of place where you might get the odd mouse. Investigators also wanted to see whether there was any rodents in the property. And they found rat droppings in a couple of the garages, in some outhouses and sheds, buildings called casitas, which are little guest houses. In the garages, they found evidence of live rodents, dead rodents, and their nests. There were also traps in all sorts of buildings that suggested that this had been something of an ongoing issue. Autopsy reports led police to believe that Betsy must have died on or around February the 12th. Hackman's time of death was determined by data from his pacemaker. It suggested that he'd passed away on or around February the 18th. Gene Hackman's official cause of death was heart disease, combined with effects from the advanced stages of Alzheimer's. Gene's stomach was empty, but he wasn't suffering from dehydration, suggesting that during those 6 days he had been able to get up from his chair and find the odd glass of water. But he wasn't taking his medication, and that may very well have contributed to his death. When you arrive on a story, and especially one when all sorts of theories are doing the rounds about what may or may not be true, my job is to kind of cut through all that noise and try and establish what is credible and what isn't. On a story like this, I kind of liken journalism to a form of, if you like, of fishing. You sort of cast a net, you reach out to as many people as possible who might know something about the subject that you're writing about, and you wait and see who bites, who comes back, who will talk to you. And if you're lucky, you'll get to speak to lots and lots of different people. And from interviewing them and looking at kind of primary sources, documents or whatever, you can normally get pretty close to the truth. When you strip back all the noise and sensationalism and you actually just do the legwork and speak to people on the ground, sometimes you do discover that the most likely and some ways dull explanation is also the true one. And in this case, what emerged was a sad, everyday story. With the facts of Gene and Betsy Hackman's death established, I'd usually go home. But what I'd come across and had sort of intrigued me during the process of investigating was some of the other things really about their life and about the years they spent in Santa Fe and the community that they built up around them. People shared some really charming stories about Gene and Betsy and their life in Santa Fe.
Tell me these photos you've got.
Okay, there's one of the world's most famous actors. So here's the story. Had a 4th of July celebration. Obviously, it's outside. Prankster Gene, he says, I want you and Tom and Leslie to come. Let's have a table. We'll get a table. And he goes, so he's always, you know, just, he loves to really suck it to me. So anyway, he goes, it's a cowboy theme.
Right.
And so you better go to the costume shop and you better get some boots and you better get some, and you better get the scarf and you better get the hat and the vest and all this. And he said, because, you know, I don't want you to embarrass us, you know, sitting at our table because we're all going to be dressed as, you know, this is a real Western affair. So I'm going, holy. So I go and try to put all this stuff together. I get there and I get out of the car. I'm kind of walking up and looking around. I see Gene, and he's laughing his ass off because everybody else is in shorts and blue jeans and golf shirts, and I'm the only idiot there with the cowboy hat on and all this stuff that I put together. He is laughing, and he thought that was so funny. So then we go over. Then we go over to the table. We're sitting at the table, and he disappears. I had my camera. I was taking some pictures of my real cowboy buddies. They were in the show that they had. And so I see Gene, and they had these little water stations set up for the kids. And I see Gene negotiating with this 8-year-old to let him borrow his squirt gun. Yeah. And so that's a picture of him filling up his squirt gun.
What sort of year would this be?
Maybe 2010. So he fills up his squirt gun, and he turns around, he gets that look on his face, and at our table, and kind of squirting everybody. He's having a ball. Here's an 80-something-year-old guy out there squirting everybody. Then I see him going behind this little wooden structure, and I can see in his right hand he's got a bottle of red wine. And I can see him filling up the squirt gun with red wine. And I said,
spring break.
Yeah. I said, Steve, I see you. I know what you're doing. He turned around. You better run. So that's Gene.
He also spoke about how Gene and Betsy had been all over the dance floor at his wedding a few years ago, leading the conga line.
Go in we call it the barn, and here's Gene and Betsy. They've got this conga line type thing going on.
Okay.
They've got
lowering the tone.
Everyone's got their arms around each other, and they're all in a line across, and so they'd run forward and kick, and everybody's watching Gene. Then they'd run backwards, and then they'd kick again. Everybody's had a few, and they're just laughing. And I said, okay, this is awesome. And so I said, well, probably just last couple minutes. I looked up 15 minutes later, they're still just having a great time.
Many aspects of Gene's life in Santa Fe were very unusual for a Hollywood star. He was doing the sort of things that normal people do. Doug shared a very cute story about how Gene had been in their restaurant one night and a party on their way to a high school prom had come in.
One particular occasion, it was prom night, and the place was full of, and these kids recognized Gene. They were whispering and whatnot, and so he went over, said hello to them all. He got up, went over, then he bought their whole meal. And they're all in their tuxedos and dresses and whatnot, and they were just blown away. But that's Gene. Yeah. That's Gene. He's just very, very giving.
Gene Hackman was also famously pugnacious, and there was the odd altercation along the way.
There was a time he had a fight in Hollywood over traffic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he was coming down, where he was living or whatever. These guys recognized him, and they, started harassing him a little bit. So stopped at a stoplight, and so they bumped him.
Oh wow!
Behind. It's Gene being Gene, puts it in drive, goes forward, puts it in reverse, and just whacks him. So then they go to the next stoplight, and I think it's a pretty busy little area, and
this is in Los Angeles.
Yeah. And so the guys two of them get out of the car, and Gene gets out of the car, and they go for it. And
right.
They're frustrated. I said, Gene, how'd you do? He said, well, I was on my back, and I kind of looked up over my head, and there's a bus stop, and a poster there, with these bus stops, and they, advertising. He said, and there I was on the poster. Gene Hackman starring in something. He goes, Hackman, what in the hell are you doing? To hear him talk about it was just so much fun. And he was always so funny. I said, Gene, what do you do? You know, we talk about fights and that sort of thing. And you know, I said, how do you do it? He said, here's how you do it. He said, put your hands up like this and go, hey man, I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. You know, then you just zero in on his nose. And then you just, he said, drive his nose right through it. I said, okay.
My time in Santa Fe was coming to an end, and while I'd arrived with all sorts of unanswered questions, the real story had by now become pretty clear. The couple's deaths were caused by a tragic combination of long-term health problems, unusual living conditions, and a freak illness. I spoke to Ivan one last time to see what else he could remember about them.
Yeah, that is sad, but in a way too, it's like you think of your loved ones when if they pass before you or after you, and you know there's going to be a lot of pain there either way, right?
Yeah, right.
So, you know, I mean, the way I see it is like, hey, they're happy together and in a better place.
I've been Guy Adams, and this has been the real story of Gene Hackman's death.